minutes after 6, I will now call to order the March 28th, 2016 meeting of the East Hampton Conservation Commission. The meeting is being recorded, and we both signed in. Great. Are there any public concerns, non-agenda items? All right, being none, we'll move along to public hearings and meetings. First is a continuation of a notice of intent for the construction of a commercial property off O'Neill Street. Mass DEP file number 151287. Brief update followed by the applicant's request for a continuation. The Doucette and Associates and Emily Stockman have been to the site to begin the peer review process.
Who's Emily Stockman?
She's a wetland scientist that works with.
She's a sub-consultant.
She's kind of a sub-consultant to Doucette.
Yeah.
Great. Based on their observations, which have not been provided in any detail, there are going to be revisions to at least the stormwater. The applicant has requested that we continue the hearing to our April 11th meeting. So is there a motion to continue this to April 11th at 6 p.m.?
Move to continue to April 11th at 6 p.m.
I'll second the motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Well, that took a lot less time than I thought the topic would. All right, moving on to the notice of intent for the removal of nuisance aquatic vegetation to retard pond and lake eutrophication via herbicide application in Nashwanik Pond. Notice of intent submitted by the City of East Hampton, Mass DEP file number 151288.
Okay, my name's Gary Goldis. I'm here representing the City of East Hampton for the notice of intent to manage aquatic vegetation for Nashwanik Pond. Quick overview of the pond. I think if you live in East Hampton, anywhere near East Hampton, you're probably pretty familiar with it. A lot of the projects for the pond have come before the board over the years. This is Nashwanik Pond, right in the center of East Hampton. You have the Broadbrook Inlet on the southern end, the Wilton Brook Inlet, pretty much where we are right now, and the White Brook Inlet, which is in the park. Broadbrook Inlet is responsible for about 72% of the water flow for the pond. White Brook about 7%. Wilton Brook a little over 20%, and direct precipitation and groundwater about 1%. It does have a Bassfield Gate Dam where the water overflows. The detention time for the pond is about 7 days, which is extremely fast, which really ties into what we can do as far as applying herbicides and algicides through the pond. The retention time being so low, we can't put something in there that we need time to take weeks to take effect. The pond was originally built in 1847 by Samuel Williston. He dammed up the 3 tributaries to create hydropower for his button manufacturing business. It was originally about 50 acres in size. Right now it's a little over 30 acres in size. Various projects over the years. Notice that one of the comments from DEP was making reference to projects that have been done previously. They go all the way back to blocking access to points along the pond so that vehicles can't drive up onto the points, thereby compressing the soils, thereby not allowing vegetation to grow, and it makes for the sediments an easy way for them to flow directly into the pond. Some of the more expensive projects over the years was putting a gabion weir on Wilton Brook. That was done in 1992. It's been very successful. It has certainly held back a lot of the sediments. Basically, it's like putting a blockade in the brook itself, which doesn't allow the sediments to flow from the brook into the pond. Broadbrook in the early 2000s, that received a siltation basin. Basically, it took a brook that was flowing straight, gave it a meander, and that allowed the water to slow down, allowing sediments to settle out in the basin rather than in the pond. Just last year, the boathouse, which is right about in this area right here, you can kind of see the little sandy area right here, that received a access for boats to have access to the pond. That was just completed last year, as well as probably all familiar with the boardwalk that is now around the pond. So it's received a lot of projects over the years, including the dredge. I mean, the dredge was the big project 4 or 5 years ago, which removed about 50,000 cubic yards of soil from the pond. Applying herbicides and algicides is not something the city of East Hampton takes lightly. If there was alternative means, we would certainly look into them, which we have. All those projects have been implemented, including one I didn't mention was the deep sump pumps, deep sump basins were installed around the pond, as well as Technic type catch basins, which swirl the sediments out of the water before they enter the pond. So all these steps have been taken, and we still have aquatic vegetation that is overtaking the pond. The problem is that the pond has almost a 10 square mile watershed. So all the nutrients, everything that happens within 10 square miles makes its way into the pond. If there was a way that we could control the watershed, not let the fertilizers, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the other chemicals that enter the pond, we would be going that route. We've done public education to tell the people in the watershed that, you know, this is your BMP, this is the best management practice you can take. But it's clear that after all these steps were taken, an additional step does need to be taken, and that step is what we're proposing tonight, is the application of herbicides/algicides. We're proposing to have 2 different chemicals. One is Diquat. It's been around for about 30 years, so it's not anything that's a new and improved things that we're going to try to use Nashwauk Pond as the test site. It's used primarily to control the macrophytes, and the macrophytes being the large weeds in the pond. And the other chemical is called Captain. It's a chelated copper, and that works primarily on the algae. I do have a BMP, which is another form that needs to be submitted to DEP. I can leave a copy with you, and you can peruse it at your leisure. It's something that does not have to be submitted prior to this meeting, and in fact, DEP, the watershed management portion, won't even look at this application until an order of conditions is written. They'll accept it, but they're waiting for the order of conditions. But that gives you more detailed information about the chemicals, the application rate, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have any further questions about the chemicals, I'd be happy to answer them. So we have not just prolific native weeds in the pond, the 2 most dominant being Elodea canadensis, and the other one being what's commonly called coontail. Those are native to this area, but they're very prolific. There's too much of them, and what happens is that as they die, they sink to the bottom, they decay, and they use up oxygen. And as the bacteria is taking care of breaking down these macrophytes, in the process, the waters become anoxic, and therefore the fish and other organisms simply can't live in there. There's sections of the pond that the bottom is literally anoxic, or at least close to it, where you have maybe 1 or 2 parts per million of dissolved oxygen, which is not enough for these aquatic organisms to live. So what we're proposing is to reduce the density of the native population, and there is also 2 invasives in the pond, one being water chestnut, which along this area right in here, turn this a little bit more for you guys, which is in this area right in here, there was literally, we took out 1 year, I believe it was 22 tons of water chestnut, followed up by about 11 tons the next year. It's still in the pond, and luckily it's a floater, so that it's something that you can literally grab with your hand, put it into your boat or whatever water vessel you have, Dragon boat, maybe, Dan, you know, a lot of room in a dragon boat for the water chestnuts. But you can harvest it, bring it to the shoreline, let it desiccate, basically dry out, and dispose of it. They still come back on occasion because they have a little nut on them that sticks to waterfall, especially, and they sink to the bottom and they come back in the following years. I probably took out maybe 10 of the water chestnuts last year, 10 to 15 as I was just, you know, in my kayak. So it's under control, and we're not as concerned about the water chestnut as much as the Eurasian milfoil. Eurasian milfoil is highly aggressive, non-native, invasive, and at this point there's not a lot of it in the pond, but it's definitely there. And because of the way it grows and takes over, it will outcompete the native vegetation, and pretty soon all you'll see is green mats of Eurasian milfoil. It was first discovered in the U.S., I think in 1942. I discovered it in the pond a few years back. To my dismay, I remember picking up a piece of macrophyte and saying, no, please, this can't be Eurasian milfoil, but sure enough it was. So we want to eradicate the Eurasian milfoil because that doesn't belong here. It's invasive. It'll take over the pond. The native species we want to keep in the pond, but not in the prolific state that they are now. There is a proposed buffer around the entire pond, and this is not to scale, but around the entire pond there's a 10-foot no application buffer, as well as two 50-foot buffers on the White Brook and Broad Brook inlets. This area right in here in Broad Brook, it gets very shallow. So even if somebody wanted to get into this area with a boat to apply these herbicides, they couldn't get there anyway. So clearly more than a 50-foot buffer will be observed on the Broad Brook inlet. The only exceptions to these 10-foot no application zones would be in the areas where there is a high concentration of the Eurasian milfoil, and that's mostly right in this area right in here where the new boardwalk is, as well as at the beach house, right? It used to be called the beach house now, but it's just the way that you get to the pond through the new ramp. And you know, it's a guess, but it's probably due to fishermen, you know, because they have a little bit on the tip of their rod, and as they cast out, a little bit of this falls off. I mean, you know, this is a big generalization, but that's one of the ways that it gets into ponds. And there is signage up now at Boathouse Beach saying to, you know, wash off your boat. Don't go into the pond or leave the pond with these macrophytes on there. There are other areas where it does exist, and that's this one right here. And I don't know if your eyes are better than mine, but I probably couldn't see it from, especially where you're sitting, Melissa, but anything that is labeled MS is where there's a pretty good concentration of the milfoil. I'm sorry, EC. Let's see here. What was my key here?
Eurasian milfoil.
Yeah, Eurasian.
SMS.
Okay, thank you so much. So we see that there's a lot of concentrations sporadically here and there. Like I mentioned, the highest concentrations right here and right here at the Boathouse Beach, but there are other areas that would be hit simply because those are areas that need to be eradicated. As far as the concentration of what the macrophytes look like in a typical season, that's this map here. So what we propose to do is when the weather gets a little bit warmer and we start getting more macrophytes and algae in the pond, that I would go down, or the Conservation Commission is certainly welcome to join us, or anybody else who wants to join us, is to go down and look at how the macrophytes and algae are progressing this year, because there is no guarantee from year to year to year it's going to be exactly the same. So the areas in here, right here that are in green, those are pretty low density. So we propose to go very lightly in these areas here. What we want to do is hit the areas that have the higher concentrations. So the 75% to 100% range. This area, this White Brook Cove, we'd like to hit pretty good. Again, keeping in mind the 10-foot buffer. But this is covered in algae and covered in the milfoil as well as every other macrophyte that we have in the pond. So that's an area that would get a lot of attention. These areas in here, like I mentioned, even though they're high in concentration, the water gets very shallow very fast, so chances are very good that we wouldn't be able to even get a boat in there to apply herbicides/algicides to this area here. And it's as, like I say, we don't want to say tonight that we're going to treat here, 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 but not here and here, because this will be an ongoing project. The chemicals that we propose to use are contact herbicides, which means that the only parts of the macrophytes that will get killed are the parts that the actual chemical touches. So the roots are not going to be getting killed on all these. So this is not a project that we will do one time and walk away from. This will be an ongoing project for years to come. The idea is get rid of the milfoil, and as we treat this, we should be getting less and less of the native populations as well. So what's a healthy population? There's three main trophic states that I use. Eutrophic, which certainly our pond is, and our pond you could classify it as cultural eutrophication because it's man-induced. This is not a natural progression that we see here. This is because of what man does, the fertilizers that they put on their grasses, etc. There's the middle of the road, the mesotrophic, which is what we would like to shoot for, where there's a healthy amount of macrophytes. And there's the oligotrophic state, where that's a state where you look at a body of water, which can look very clear, very pristine, but it's usually very low in nutrients and very low in biomass because there isn't the macrophytes and to support the population of aquatic organisms. So we're going for that middle of the road kind of application. Okay. Anything else? I think that's our proposal. Again, keeping in mind that we would come before the commission before any application is done, and we propose to do dissolved oxygen analysis no more than 7 days before the application. Obviously, if the dissolved oxygen levels are too low at that point, we would not apply any herbicides or algicides. It would have to be above the approved limits that the conservation would set. Signage would be put up. All these herbicides and algicides would be disposed of properly, the containers. I think I pretty much cover what we're proposing to do as far as the safety. And any questions at this point before I keep rambling?
So I guess my first question is administrative, and I understand the city was taking care of the abutter notifications, and there was some discussion, someone was taking care of abutter
No,
notifications?
actually, right here, the
So
abutter
could I-
notifications
great.
are right here.
Thank you.
And luckily,
Great. Well,
it was taken care of not by me
Thank you.
because
Do you
one
need the
less thing for
originals
me to
back?
do.
No.
you don't,
I'm sorry.
okay.
All set.
I know that was part of the discussion at
Yes.
one point, so.
Yeah,
Sure.
there was whether or not the commission needed the originals or copies, but
Okay.
hopefully that's all been straightened out.
As long as there's proof and I'll go through them, but
Yeah.
based on the stack. Okay.
I have questions, mostly just out of personal interest, because I've never really been involved in a, project like this. I think I was on the commission last time you treated before the dredging project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you were probably on board for two of the project. One was in 2011, we came before the board to get an order of conditions to take out the sediments for the White Brook and Brown
Right.
Brook sedimentation basins. That order of conditions is still in effect. Unfortunately, the money is just simply not there at this point to fund those projects. But an order of condition has been written for them.
Yep, and you did herbicide application like in 2008 or 2007
Well,
or
not
something?
for Nashawanek Pond. I was
Oh, okay.
a consultant for Williston that
Okay.
did herbicide applications
Yeah,
for,
that's what
for
it was.
Williston Pond.
Gotcha.
And I believe they use the same chemicals plus one other, I'm not sure. Their vegetation is very similar, but it's a little bit different. They have a lot of lily pads, and people, they're pretty, but their pond is covered in them. So that was a successful venture, at least the initial part of it. I haven't kept up with it. A representative from Williston actually contacted me, maybe it was last year, about going forward with more applications, but I mentioned that I'm probably not the person to talk to because I wasn't involved with the Conservation Commission any longer at this point.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess how is the herbicide applied? I guess it's not water soluble, it sounds like, so you can really target where it goes.
Yeah,
Doesn't mix through
Right.
the whole
What
area.
it has in it, it has a surfactant in the chemical, in the batch itself. So it only kills what it actually touches. If it doesn't touch, let's just say there's a macrophyte here and a macrophyte here, you spray this one, it not necessarily going to kill it. Again, remember, it's only going to kill the part that the actual chemical touches. So if it's got a big root system going down below the water and it doesn't touch it, it's not going to kill the entire plant. But the good part of it is, and again a comment from DEP was that there is some good emergent vegetation that they don't want killed, which is our concern as well. So as long as it doesn't get applied and touch that vegetation, it doesn't kill it.
Yeah. So, so is it pretty much spot applied from a boat? Like
It is a boat. I don't know. Basically, it's like well, they have the people that do it. This is the old Lycott going back years and years,
Yeah.
and they've since changed their name a couple times. But they have a really good history. This is what they've been doing for a long, long time.
Yep.
And they have several vessels that they can apply from. But the one for this pond here is probably going to be something similar to a rowboat that has a little motor on it, and they have a tank right inside their boat. They can take pond water and mix it with the chemical, and the application rate is set. There's an approved rate of application that the manufacturer sets, and that's listed in the notice of intent as well as the WM04 that I gave you.
Yeah.
So that the rate is within the approved limits, and we actually aren't going to go to the high end of that. We're going to kind of go to the lower end of that. The other thing is we're not going to apply to more than 15 acres at one time. So the pond is approximately 15 acres in size. So at no point will we ever apply more than and have 15 acres being treated at one time. And if we, again, this is why it's time of the year dependent. If for some reason we wait too long and the vegetation gets too prolific, we simply won't treat it all in one application. We'll do a split application where we'll do a part of it, let the weeds die off, let the oxygen levels come back up to normal levels, because there will be, as I say, as the vegetation does die off, they will, have to be decomposed by bacteria, and the bacteria uses oxygen in the process of this decomposition process. So we would never intentionally, and we're pretty careful, but I've worked with this company a couple of times, and they know what they're doing, and with your, whatever rules you guys want to set up, we'll certainly follow as far as being as safe as possible.
And so how often, and forgive me if this is covered in the application, I don't remember seeing it, how frequently would the applications be, and how many in a season, say?
Yeah, that's completely open-ended. We look to treat, especially this year, because I've noticed there's already algae forming on the pond, and we're only in March. Usually it just doesn't happen this early, but we've had a very strange weather year. So what we want to do is, even in typical winters, we want to go to a late spring, early summer application. The water is still on the cooler side. The cooler the water, the more dissolved oxygen the water can hold. So we don't want to do this in the middle of August when the water is very warm. So, but that will be an on-site call where, again, the Conservation Commission, the representative from the herbicide company, as well as myself, will go down to the pond, we'll look at the amount that's actively growing and make a decision and when that first application should be applied. It's possible that a second application later in the year might be necessary, but again, there's no hard, fast rules in that. It's really, you know, part of it is monetary, and part of it is just makes sense. But this will be ongoing for many years to come. This is not something that we're gonna do this year and all of a sudden our problems are cured. Again, because of the large watershed we have. That's why we would love, if we could, we'd love to change the things externally from the pond. We'd love to, so that these nutrients simply don't come into the pond anymore, but you can't control a 10-acre watershed. So the nutrients will continue to come, and with time, the application rates will probably be less and less frequent, but it's a wait and see type of a situation. There's just no way of saying that pond A is the same as pond B, so we know exactly what to do with pond B. Okay.
I have a question. So based on this figure, how did you come up with the methods of figuring out how much was in each area?
Now, we're not in my kayak.
You did?
Yeah.
So there's no like scientific way you did it?
No, you basically, when I say 0 to 25%, I mean, hypothetically, this could be, you know, in this green area in here, this could be 28%. So it was basically my eye versus maybe somebody else's eye would have drawn this map up a little bit differently. But in certain areas, it's really obvious what areas are clear. Like I say, right down through the middle here, there you just don't see anything. So there's, other than the fact that there may be some milfoil in this area, I mean, it may be 10%, 20%. So you may want to hit a spot here, a spot there. But for the most part, we're going to just leave this part alone. And we're going to hit up the areas, you know, right in town where, you know, that's, I mean, there's several reasons to do this. And from the Wetlands Protection Act perspective, you know, recreational value is not part of this. But the reality is that, you know, we want the pond to be used by people and people to enjoy it. So we're going to not only take care of the part that says we are taking care of the fisheries habitat, but we're also taking care of the aesthetics part. So we're going to definitely hit up the areas where people use for the most part. And those are the areas anyways that are high in all types of macrophytes and algae anyway. So those parts should get hit up.
Is that figure going to be resubmitted every year with new measurements?
I was thinking of that as the.
Yeah, certainly this is, again, it's an ongoing thing. So before any application gets done, and so let's say 2017, a map would have to, you'd have to go out there again and see what parts are coming back strong, what parts are not coming back strong. So yes, an updated map would be a good asset to have.
Regarding the application of the herbicides, is it like I'm picturing like a guy out in the yard with the Roundup sprayer?
Somewhat similar.
Is it kind of a spray?
Yeah, I mean,
like
the best one I ever saw was they actually, and you can buy these, and it wouldn't be applicable for our pond, but you can buy like a little boat, like a little toy boat, and you can put the chemical right in the boat, and as you're steering the boat from the shoreline, it's releasing the chemical.
Just into the water.
Into the water, which is not the kind that we're doing here. I mean, with our types of macrophytes, the boat would get stuck in 10 seconds. It just wouldn't work for us. The other part that I failed to mention was the fact that we need the macrophytes and algae to be actively growing. It's not a preventative. So you can't say, let's go out there in April, put the chemicals in, and then we're not going to get any macrophytes and algae growing. They have to be actively grown, but we want to get them before they get too prolific.
So it's sprayed on the water.
Yeah.
It's not released like.
For the yeah, just picture a big tank, you know, that can, and again, because they want to go not just broad spectrum and just let it go anywhere, they will direct where the chemicals are actually being applied. Yes.
It sounds like because of the method of treatment, it's just you'll be treating small amounts of the plants at a time. Have you looked into mechanical removal? Is that a possibility at all?
Well, there is, when you're talking mechanical, are you talking like a weed harvester?
Yeah, or hand pulling.
Hand pulling is not a bad idea, and in limited application, it can be done, but it has to be done very carefully. Number one, it's very labor intensive, so unless you can get a lot of volunteers out there, it's very expensive. And number two is the way a lot of these macrophytes reproduce is by stem fragments. So if you pull on a piece of macrophyte and you don't get every part of it, you now have another macrophyte just growing. And you can actually exacerbate the problem by and especially mechanical harvesting, where you get a weed harvester out there, which is basically like mowing your grass. In some areas, you know, I've seen it done. I'm not a big proponent of it because, I mean, think about just mowing your grass. You're just mowing the top little part, and then all those fragments that just get spread everywhere are just fodder for more macrophytes to come back. But hand harvesting is not a bad way of dealing with them, again, as long as you can get the entire root system, and it could be something that we do use as a supplement for a project such as this in the future.
No, I'm just trying to understand the whole process. Are you guys familiar with the chemical that's being used? It's something I've
I'm
not heard of.
familiar with them being commonly used.
Okay, all right.
Are there any negative impacts to fish and wildlife?
Not really. They've done studies on tissues of fish after these herbicides and algicides have been done, and it doesn't bioaccumulate in the fish. One of the things the copper does do is that it does go and bind up into sediments of whatever part of body of the water you're actually putting it in. Now, under normal conditions, copper is not a bad thing to have in your water, but over a long period of time, you have to be careful that you don't get too big of a bioaccumulation of it. The only things that really, scientific studies have looked into and have found that if you use even the recommended doses of some of these herbicides, algicides, is that some of the invertebrates are adversely affected. So even though they're within the recommended ranges, you can get some adverse effects. So that's why we're going on the lower end of the application rate. And some of the vegetation that's going to be removed, they say you find less things like Daphnia magna, which is just a little water flea. Well, that's true because they don't have their habitat any longer. So they'll have to mosey on to another area that does have a habitat that's more suitable for their existence.
So you mentioned accumulation of copper in sediments.
Yes.
Has there been any analysis of what background is, and would there be any, post-application after a certain number of years or a certain number of applications? Has there been any discussion or thought of doing a check on that? Because if there were to be a future dredge, you'd have to deal with whatever dredge.
I'll be long gone before we can afford another dredge. I think this is the one that we got and it was pretty successful. And again, if we had a little bit more funds, we could have done a little bit more. But there was extensive studies done of all the chemical analysis of the sediments before anything could be removed. So there probably is data that's, would probably, because if you go back to the notice of intent for the dredge, there was 30 pages of chemical analysis of everything that could possibly be the sediments.
What's left?
And again, what we took out, or the city took out, or however which way you want to use the words, was like what we call like a shipping channel. Right down the center of the pond is where the sediments were taken out. So if you went to one side where the sediments were not removed, you're probably going to get a different readings as far as the chemical analysis and where they were taken out right from the middle.
Does that largely correspond to the 0 to 25% area there, that continuous, where the dredge footprint was?
Sort of
More or
right
less?
through the middle of this, yeah. It went everywhere. It could, again, because of this area in here, you simply couldn't get anything down here to dredge. And there's some houses that are on the banks over here that were hoping that they were gonna get that area dredged out. Number one, there wasn't the money for it. Number two, it just wasn't feasible. So the cove in this area got dredged. By the boathouse area, right down the middle, that got dredged. So basically, if you can picture maybe from here all the way through here, probably stopped right around here, because this was the deepest end. This is about 15.5 feet deep. And I was hoping that they were gonna be able to remove the sediments from the deeper end, because there's about 9 feet of soft sediments right there. And which, I mean, if we could have gone from 15.5 feet to 20-something feet, that would have been amazing. But again, you know, due to the lack of funds, we had to get what we can get. So yeah, just picture a channel right down through the middle of the pond. Now, that being said, this was not a high area of macrophytes previous of the dredge. Again, this has the more depth, and we needed that extra depth for several reasons, but removal of macrophytes was not one of them. Unfortunately, some people were promoting the dredge as a cure-all for the macrophyte problem. I was not one of those people, because, you know, while it was a great project and a vital project, I don't know if I'd even be standing in front of you now if we didn't dredge. I'm not sure if it would make any sense, given the nature of the way the pond was filling in. You know, certain areas, there was elevation shot. And in some areas, 6 inches were removed. In other areas, 3.5 feet were removed. So it was one of these things, where can we get the best bang for a buck? Because we originally wanted 55,000 cubic yards removed. We didn't quite get that for various reasons. It was a little under that, but nevertheless, you know, a lot of the sediments were removed, and we had to kind of, again, sort of like this project here, we had to pick and choose the best areas to do the project, and how much sediments to be removed from certain areas.
So how are you intending to measure success?
Whatever Melissa says.
You know, I mean, I'm.
Yeah,
I
no,
just
it's a
you know, for an ecological restoration, even a limited project, you know, for a dam removal, it's that the dam is gone. For aquatic vegetation management, it's that the vegetation's being managed, and so you know, you've got a distribution, and you've got concentrations.
Well,
so I guess what's the target?
So the goal is to eradicate the Eurasian milfoil. That's the invasive. That's the macrophyte, as well as the water chestnut, which is under pretty much control at this point. Is to eradicate that. So if we can get rid of the Eurasian milfoil, that's in itself is a huge success, because if we don't get rid of it, every year it's just going to come back stronger and stronger, and pretty soon that pretty boardwalk that we see there, no one's going to want to go there, because it's going to be a swamp. So that's you know, number one success story, get rid of the Eurasian milfoil. Number two is simply, when I can show you a new density map, and now all of a sudden this area in green is more extensive, and these areas in blue maybe went from 75% and now they're in that 50% range. So a healthy amount of macrophytes. Again, the goal will never be to eradicate the macrophytes. Some people look at the macrophytes and say, well, we want them gone. Well, you're going to have a very unhealthy pond that won't support the fish population that people want in there without the macrophytes. So a healthy amount of vegetation, and you know, again, a very good idea to go out yearly if we're going to apply that year. Again, there may be a year that gets skipped. It's going to be a lot of things depending upon this, whether the funds are available, whether it needs it. Maybe down the line we don't even need it, which would be another indication of the success, is that the algae is limited this year. The macrophytes are limited this year, so we don't even have to treat this year.
Based on the funding, and I'm not asking for the numbers, but based on the funding available to start this project, how many years of treatment do you anticipate?
Applications.
Right, or applications, right, that's the better.
Well, we've been very fortunate. The Florence Savings Bank has contributed $10,000 to this project. You didn't want a number, but there's your number.
I admit that was in the
Yeah, so whether or not that's an ongoing contribution, is to be seen. They didn't sign off and said, we're gonna fund this whenever you need this, but they've been a very generous bank over the years to other projects that have been funded more than just the one time.
So what is that by?
Yeah.
10,000?
Yeah.
Me? No. This will cover the application.
One application?
Yeah, this will cover
So
the initial
this is
application.
Initial, so 1 year or one application?
One application.
Okay.
And so, again, they're giving us a range right now. Here's the range, because, again, it's dependent upon what we see probably towards the end of June. We go out there and say, well, we really need to hit this area, really need to hit this area, so let's do this much this year. So it's a pretty much a range, but certainly there is more than enough. There's also National Running Pond Steering Committee funds which are available. Whether or not the city will ever pick this up directly,
CPA?
again, we don't know. I mean,
I
there's
love how everybody looks at me.
Yeah.
You are the city's representative here.
I know, but I can't speak on the city's behalf.
Yeah,
and that's a call by the mayor.
Is this
so
a sort
it's
of project that could qualify for CPA?
potentially?
Okay.
We-
What about public education and better signage? Because Gary mentioned points of access for fishing and boating as points of introduction for invasive species.
Again, if there's
And-
grant money that could hire or help with an educational campaign. or
Yeah.
something.
There are new signs at the
Signs.
boat ramp, like.
But
Yeah,
what about,
I-
I mean, people fish
All over.
much
Yeah.
closer to the center and,
That I think we can
Is that
get the
something-
word out, as, I shouldn't say we, because I'm no longer part of the steering committee, but obviously
really
I'm
not.
closely associated with them.
We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about that. But, you know, they're a very good group, and through their efforts, I think a lot of what we do has come to the forefront of now the community really knows what's going on with the pond rather than hearsay or what they read in the newspaper. So the idea is that we can post websites that the pond has and refer to this, whether or not we can actually put up signage. It would be money very well spent, in my estimation, to educate the public as much as possible, whether or not it's signage, whether or not it's through websites. Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, many years ago, I'm dating myself, but well, let's just say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, did an educational component to manage the Nashawanek Pond watershed. It was done for mostly public employees at that point, but the public was also invited. So something like that could certainly come up. Tomorrow night, there's going to be a water,
Is it the integrated
Jessica,
water
and
resource?
there you go.
Integrated water plan,
Right.
but I mean, that's more about the water systems, and
Yeah.
sewer systems, it's not necessarily,
The storm drains.
Yeah.
well, it's about storm,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Well, they did ask me to come, so I will come.
Okay.
Actually, somebody did contact me from the company and said, asked for some information. And so if for nothing else, if there's any questions, I can
Well,
hopefully
yeah,
answer
but
them.
definitely the stormwater and the drainage
Yeah.
and how that impacts the pond, I mean,
Yeah.
that's key.
Yeah.
So, and with the new NIMBYs stuff coming out
who knows when.
whenever,
Yeah,
you know, there may be some stuff that has to be done in order to address those new standards, so.
right.
You also mentioned, because obviously taking a comprehensive look at the watershed is a great idea, and I understand time and resources are limited. You mentioned actually stormwater treatment units at strategic points around the pond?
Yeah,
Does the DPW maintain those?
yeah,
Who-
they do.
They do?
Well,
does
they
the
have,
DPW?
there were 8 deep sumps put in that do drain into the pond. So before, all the sediments were drained directly in, now you have the sump that can collect the sediment, as well as there were several vortectic catch basin types
Do you
put in.
remember how many?
I think there was 3 of those. One you can actually see is right at the boathouse beach.
Okay,
I mean, I say you see it, but it's there.
right.
Now, if you do one application, how much does that gain you if you can't do another application for 3 years? If you don't have funds for 3 years to do this again,
Well, again, that's beyond my call, you know, I can't speak for the funds that the city are willing to give towards this project, whether or not there are grant money available for this. we anticipate doing this more than once. The likelihood of only doing it once is very small, but I can't speak for how the funds are going to be spent.
No, but would the growth come back in 3 years? Would it come back in 1 year? If you
Well,
don't do
it may come back the same year.
Yeah, okay.
Again, we're only hitting at maximum 15 acres, so there are parts that simply won't get hit up
Right.
at all. So those obviously, the parts that don't get hit will be just as strong, if not stronger, next year. We're hoping the parts that do get hit will be a little less. And again, with more applications, whether it means one application this year, two applications this year, the idea is that it will come back less and less. But at no point, and I have to be honest, and I can't, give you the Kool-Aid here and say that we do this a couple times and this will never have to be
Right.
done again. This is an ongoing project and that's why in the notice of intent, I make reference to the fact that we're not requesting a one-time application, that an order of conditions get written up with the idea is that this will be an ongoing project. Before any application though, we would come before, whether it's me or somebody else, would come before the board, say, another year, another application. And the form that you have in front of you, this right here, this has to be filled out every single time, every year that you apply. So that's, even though we hope an order of conditions will be written for a one-time deal that will cover many years into the future, that paperwork will have to be done every year.
So I'm thinking about how we could like spread the funds further. I come from a company that does aquatic vegetation management as well, and we only treat like 50% of a water body. So I'm wondering if like we could just focus on like the most abundant areas of where the invasive species are instead of treating the entire water body at once.
Well, that is what
Like,
we're
can we
going to
do, like,
do.
You said 15 acres, like how?
Yeah,
How
so,
much
I
does
mean,
that cover?
again, we're just using round numbers here, so picture this pond as being 30 acres plus or minus.
Okay.
So at a maximum, we're going to treat 15 acres of that. If we treated more than that, we'd run the likelihood of going into an oxygen deficit and getting fish kill and so on. So the idea is to hit up, again, the areas like right in here, which have the milfoil, but there's also a lot of algae there, there's a lot of other macrophytes there, so that area that's a guaranteed area. Down by the boathouse, that's a guaranteed area. So there are certain areas that we know are gonna get hit really hard. Some of the other areas that don't have a lot of macrophytes growing in them, in the green area here, and I understand for the applicator that he's going to have to look for, oh, there's that Eurasian milfoil. That's, realistically, that's not going to happen, but because of the map that I created, they can have a pretty good idea. I mean, I can't guarantee you that this map is 100% accurate. I could have missed a couple spots, but I spent a lot of time out there and going foot by foot, basically, throughout the entire pond to give the applicator as much information as possible, so he kind of, oh, somewhere in this area there's a pretty good concentration of the milfoil. And even though there's not a lot of the other macrophytes there, I want to concentrate a little bit harder in this area here.
Yeah, so the main focus is just the milfoil.
Well,
specifically.
that's the one we want to eradicate. That's the one that we hope that we just don't see anymore somewhere down the line, whether it's in 2 years or 3 years, because we're not going to get everything. It's going to be somewhat like the water chestnuts. The water chestnuts, like I say, they're a floating macrophyte, so they're really easy to locate. The milfoil is a little bit harder to locate, because it also, if you're just looking at it in the water, there's a strong resemblance to the coontail. You really have to sometimes pick it up out of the water to see, yes, that's milfoil, that's not the coontail. So we may have spots here and there that continue to have it. And that's where maybe that spot removal, that hand removal can come into the hand, where, again, the educational component would have to be strong to mention, if you happen to see some Eurasian milfoil, and obviously a picture, and they'd have to have it clear in their mind what should be removed and what shouldn't, and that you'd have to get the entire plant, because if you're just picking out fragments, you're just exasperating the whole problem.
Does the pond stratify in the summer, or is it such a
Not
quick?
Really,
retention
not, the only part that you can, in certain years, is this area in here because it's deeper.
Yeah.
You got about 15.5 feet or so in that area. So in some years, you can see a little bit of a stratification, but it's a very short lasting stratification.
Mhm.
And that's, maybe 10% of the pond that stratifies.
Yeah, and so that helps with the dissolved oxygen too when it comes to this proposal.
Yeah, well, when I was doing, I've done a lot of research on this pond over the years, and I've taken dissolved oxygen readings in a lot of different places. And this area right in here that is the deepest is also the area that has the lowest dissolved oxygen in the middle of summer, because the water, it's just so warm, and that's where all the decomposition is occurring. From a strictly textbook type of a situation, that's the colder water. So you also think that should have the most dissolved oxygen in it, which in an ideal world, everything else being removed, that would be the water that has the most dissolved oxygen, because the colder the water, the more dissolved oxygen it can hold. But because of the decomposition that's occurring there, bacteria that's using up the oxygen, those are the areas that are actually the lowest in dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, but it's also the least productive in terms of fish habitat and everything.
Yeah, occasionally I will, not only on this pond, but I've worked on some other ponds, and I'll see somebody fishing out in the middle of a pond. I won't use any pond in specific, and they're fishing bottom, and I know there's no oxygen in the bottom there. And you try to be a nice person and say, hey, you may want to think about bringing that line up a little. Oh, I fished this pond all my life. I know where the fish are. So you go about your business. A couple hours later, you come back. Catch anything? Well, no, but, I'll get them tomorrow because I know this is the spot. I know what I'm doing. But, yeah, you're not going to get the fish hanging out where there's not oxygen. They're smart enough to move to where they can breathe.
Yep. So if we're talking about a condition on oxygen levels, it really probably doesn't matter where that is taken so much, and prior to
what I would suggest is that the commission pick a couple of reproducible areas, so that when we test this year versus next time, that we know where you want that oxygen level being taken. Because if we, even in the middle of summer when it's 90 degrees out and the water is 70 degrees, if we were to take a dissolved oxygen reading at the surface right here, we're going to get super saturation. We're going to get super high. Mm-hmm. You sink that dissolved oxygen probe lower, you're going to get basically nothing. So you may want to consider the depth that the oxygen level is taken at, and pick out some representative points that would make sense so that they could be, go back that same area year after year, and it gives you, basically a benchmark that you can look at from year to year to year.
I see a lot of things about the chemicals, handling the chemicals. Is there any concern once it's applied to the water, coming in contact with it public-wise? Or?
As the chemicals that we are using have no water restrictions as far as swimming or recreational contact. If this was drinking water, what it's not, they say don't drink the water for 1 to 3 days. If you were feeding, having livestock come down here, they say wait a day or two. But there is no restrictions as far as the public is concerned. But signage will get put up.
Right.
You don't want people coming down there and following the application boat. That hey, look at this. Let me follow this guy. And then take a water sample and say I'm thirsty. So there is part of the order conditions. I certainly highly recommend. I'm sure it would be in there anyways. Is that signage gets put up before the application.
Could there be something above and beyond just the signage, but like either a press release or some public notification to the paper? Because I just feel like, the more media choices that people won't freak out.
Yeah.
Right? We live in this new era of social media, and it's changing.
Better to know.
it changes the way
inform
we're
them.
communicating, and so if there could be, a press release sent to the Gazette, so at least
Yeah.
maybe they could write a story, so just to give people some heads up notification before they go to the pond.
Sure, I mean, the media is always a mixed blessing. Sometimes they pick, what they want to cover, and some things that I feel should be covered are not. So perhaps a little call to the Gazette or any other media sources.
Yeah, it could even just be a paragraph, it doesn't have to be a big story, but just a, statement.
And again, this is where the
Okay.
steering committee can come in to
Exactly.
hand, and that they can, post it on their Facebook page and their website.
Because
which-
some calls gonna get made to the police
Yeah.
department,
Oh, yeah.
somebody's out there putting chemicals in the pond,
Absolutely.
so, if you can,
Could the city put something on the city's website?
I mean, we could certainly do
Well,
that, and, we would wanna probably get whatever that statement is from the Nash Pond
Yes.
Committee to go through the mayor's office and the IT department on what that statement is.
Yeah.
And we'd be you have a Facebook page, and we can share whatever you put on there, but I just feel like the more
Sure.
information that
Good
can get
news
out there.
page, probably most people would see it.
Yeah, the East Hampton Good News page.
Yeah.
I was gonna say that.
Yeah.
It's true.
They should.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting what does get around, because the pond was just stocked, and lo and behold, all the fishermen were out there, so,
They were.
Oh, they,
I saw a whole bunch.
Yeah.
they follow the trucks. From
Yeah,
Patrick.
yeah. The problem was, when I was talking to some of the fishermen, is that where they come from, the water is relatively warm compared to the pond at this point, so they weren't
Oh.
biting yet. They were nibbling, but they weren't really biting. But in a day or two, they kind of acclimate themselves, and I'm sure the fishermen were enjoying some nice meals. Although a lot of them actually just catch and release around here.
Yeah. Mass Wildlife hates releasing the birds, because people will sometimes, they'll bring their truck of birds out to stock, and they open the cage and throw the bird, and then it's shot before it even gets to the ground.
there should
Or do they grouse or pheasant?
Yeah, whatever they do.
Sometimes, you get, public information is great, but there is a time and place where it's probably better off not to share.
Yeah, right.
That being one of them,
Yeah.
obviously.
They bring the police with them now when they do bird releases for that reason.
Okay, getting
Sidetrack.
Sorry,
back on track. I get sidetracked all the time.
it's my job.
So, I guess this is a minor technical detail, but the numbers that you put in the form,
Mm-hmm.
only about 10 acres. Could you provide a revised page 3 of 9?
That's square feet.
Yeah, and then,
If you calculated it out, it doesn't quite line up?
no, and I just want it to be enough.
Okay,
So if
Sure.
you could do I guess my thought is that it should be the total area of the pond the total area, not what you'll be treating at any given point in
The
time.
30+ acres.
Yep.
Yep.
And that way,
Mm-hmm.
not
Yeah.
that I imagine there'll be much nitpicking of
No,
square footages,
well,
but
that's easy
I just want the
enough.
permit to cover
Sure.
what you guys need.
Mhm.
So that allows you to treat the entire pond at some point, although you'll never
Yes.
treat more than half of it at a time.
Which we can condition.
Yeah, I mean, again, from the standpoint, even without the commission's input, it just doesn't make sense
for more than
to
15
do
acres.
more than half the pond. That's pretty standard procedures.
And then I guess I would appreciate for our files if you could quickly, just in a short written document, respond 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, to
1, 2, 3
Mark's response.
to the DEP
Yep,
comments here.
yep.
Should we read that?
Gary pretty much
Oh, didn't cover
went
them?
through them, and I
Oh,
guess the one
okay.
that I'm still, I have trouble wrapping my head around and I understand it's a difficult thing to measure, is
Is what?
comment number 2. I believe it's comment number 2.
Is it healthy?
No, comment number 3, yes.
Yeah, what the healthy,
And just, I understand that the goal is to see, reduced densities throughout the areas of application.
well, I can specify that, the removal, the eradication of the Eurasian milfoil, and touch on, what healthy is to
And that would
to
be
us.
very great, because I think that would be educational too.
Sure.
I have another question.
Go ahead.
So, when the plants die, is there any sort of management that will be happening? Because
Do they just shrivel up and sort of sink down?
I'm just concerned with like dissolved oxygen and like if they're gonna grow back because it's like more organic matter and. dissolved
Well,
oils.
what will happen is, yeah, anything that the actual herbicide touches, hypothetically, will be killed. So if it touches 50% of the plant, 50% of the plant will die. If we were using a systemic type of herbicide, all of the plant would die, including the roots, but it doesn't work well for our pond, partly because of the short retention time, 7 days. Anything that we put in there will get washed over the dam. So we also do want to reserve the option of changing the herbicides or the algicides in the future if we deem that that is necessary. So we're asking for these two, the Dicua and the Captain, which is the chelated copper, for this application. And again, because they've been around for a long time, that they've been proven over the course of time to be safe for these type of applications, and the fact that we're applying at a low rate within the range that is approved by the company and EPA, we're going to make sure that we don't overdo it. So as the part that does die sink, and literally it does, I mean, just picture it kind of going to the bottom of the pond, and that's where the bacteria come in. And the bacteria come and say, oh, here's a Big Mac for us. We're going to start eating, this dying vegetation. And over time, they decompose it. It's just like picture your leaves. If if your leaves weren't decomposed, imagine how high the leaves would be. But over time, they get decomposed. Now, at the bottom, there is very likely to be some organic matter. It's not going to be just completely gone. There will be organic matter at the bottom of the pond. Again, more in some areas than not. As I mentioned, in the center of the pond right here are about 9 feet of soft sediments. Now, it's not all organic, but a lot of it is organic. If we could have gotten rid of that and gone down to the hard bottom, and when I say the hard bottom, most of the bottom of the pond is sandy. And that's one of the advantages in our case, because with a sandy bottom, the copper has an affinity to attach itself to organic matter and clays. So because we have a sandy bottom, those chemicals will stay in suspension a little bit longer and not attach themselves as readily. Many years ago, the city, at that point it was the town of East Hampton, put copper sulfate in here. I don't know if you were even alive at that point,
I'm older than you think.
But I was alive, I think. At least I was in existence. They used copper sulfate back then, and they found at that point it was kind of a losing battle, because the chelated copper, again, depending upon what reference you want to believe, the chelated stays active for a little bit longer. You put copper sulfate in a pond, and you have 1 day of it being active. That's it. If you have a chelated copper, which is basically just a fancy name where you have a metallic ion and you have other compounds attached to it. It's like a ring structure. And it just allows it to be a little bit more effective. Although other literature will say just the opposite. Those are usually the people that are still using the copper sulfate. But I mean, I have copper sulfate in my office, in my chemical cabinet. I mean, you can buy it anywhere. Now, I can't go into the pond and put it there, but it's not such a hazardous chemical that nobody can get their hands on it. And it's not because I'm somehow special. I think anybody can buy copper sulfate. But this will we will have to pay attention to the dissolved oxygen level. So the best thing to do is, like I say, no more than 7 days prior to the application or proposed application, that the dissolved oxygen levels get monitored and submitted to the commission, and then the commission can give their approval or denial based upon those levels.
The second point on there, did I misunderstand that, saying that the removal of native vegetation should not happen?
I think they specified the emergent vegetation.
Oh, okay, so just.
So there's not a lot of emergent vegetation on the pond. That mostly is at the boathouse beach, and there's some small little sections in the center of town. And that's a very legitimate comment that we don't want the emergent vegetation to be affected. That's good that it's there, and it should stay there. So the application should not go and destroy or kill the emergent vegetation.
How far in advance does the BRP WW04 have to be submitted?
I'm gonna say 2 to 4 weeks, something to that effect. If indeed the commission does write an order of conditions for this project, it's basically filled out, just not signed. So they won't, like I say, if I submitted it now, they'll just put it on their desk and wait for an order of conditions before they'll act upon it. So if an order of conditions is written, I'll send that out right after.
Okay.
And that is written up to be good for fiscal year, well, not fiscal year, but year 16.
So if we think of a few monitoring points for dissolved oxygen 7 days in advance of application, what would we be looking for, like 4 milligram per liter or more? I mean, 2 milligram per liter is hypoxic,
Yeah,
right?
there is actual numbers that whether it's a warm body of water versus a cold body, warm versus cold body of water. And you'd like to see those dissolved oxygen levels in that 5 to 6 parts per million or milligrams per liter, whatever units you choose to use, range.
Mm-hmm.
Now the reality is that the species that are in the pond here, trout are pretty susceptible to low oxygen levels, but most of the other fish, there's still a lot of carp in there, there's still a lot of bass in there. Those numbers, it's a guideline more than a hard, fast rule. The commission can say this is the cutoff point. You know, whatever you decide is that level will be the level that it really needs to be.
Right. But you probably don't want us to say 10, right?
Well, 10 is ridiculous. Yeah, we'd have to go out there with aeration and everything to get it up to 10. Or again, we could go out in the middle of the afternoon on a sunny day and go at the surface, and we could probably get you your 10. But realistically, we want, you know, we don't want to do something just to get through the commission, just to get the permitting process. We want this done right.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to make sure those levels really can support a dip, if a dip indeed does happen. I mean, it's possible that, you know, treating just such as, you know, half the pond, if we treat it when the water is still relatively cool, if we treat it, you know, at the right time of the year, we won't have to worry as much as if we're doing this in the middle of August, where already the levels are more susceptible to taking a big downfall.
Mm-hmm. So maybe instead of hard and fast numbers, we should put in just something about reporting DO levels to the commission, you know, with that information, and then, you know, work with the commission to make a determination as to whether conditions are appropriate for applying.
Yeah.
the
Now, to be honest with you, when I've done other projects such as this, and people just look at me, yeah, I never thought about that. But what the commission may want to consider is time of the day. Because if I go out there 2 o'clock or somebody else goes out there, photosynthesis is going crazy, you gotta get levels through the ceiling.
We definitely want DO measured 3 a.m.
All right, I'll give you the meter, and you can take the dragon boat out there. But I mean, morning versus afternoon makes sense to me. And again, I would want to see that happen from the, just simply the standpoint is, I don't want to see fish floating, you know, because we did something wrong. We want to take every precaution, and again, it's just not a matter of trying to get through, you know, you guys to get in order conditions. We want to do this the right way.
So what would be the appropriate time of day to take the reading?
3 a.m.
7 o'clock,
If
8
you're willing
o'clock.
to go do it, grab a headlamp. But don't look for volunteers.
7 and 8.
Yeah,
I mean,
somewhere, you know,
Yeah.
8 o'clock, 8 a.m.
No later than 9 a.m. Or
Well,
between
depending on, again, you know, if this is, I don't know who's gonna actually do this, whether it's going to be Solitude or somebody else. I think, at least the first year, I think the company should do it. Let them earn their money the first year. But you're gonna have to get from, depending on how many points you want collected, you're gonna have to get from point A to point B to point C. So, and you're not gonna have a speedboat out there, so you gotta give them enough time to get from point A to point B to point C.
And also, you know, should we define the depth at which the reading should be taken?
You could do a profile, you know, top, middle, bottom. You know, again, that's your call.
In the same locations every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you want something that's repeatable, so.
How many locations?
4, 5.
Why don't you do it based on the map with the densities? So wouldn't there be maybe one spot up where the boardwalk is in that dark
That
blue
blue.
area?
Mm-hmm.
And then another one down in the White Brook, what did you call it, the White Brook?
Yeah, this
Channel,
White Brook,
inlet
little channel
channel.
in here,
Okay,
because this is definitely, you know, an area of concern. This might be the worst area of the entire pond as far as algae and macrophytes. The water is shallow there. It gets sunlight all day long. It's perfect growing.
so what if you did, I'm just trying to think of the efficiency of the consultant, so there's easy access from, at the top part where the boardwalk is, and then they could launch from Boathouse Beach, and then they could do another reading at Boathouse Beach, and then go across, and then get into the White Brook Channel, and that seems like it wouldn't take too much time to maybe do those 3 points.
Yeah, I mean, if you work,
Input is great.
if you work off of the actual boardwalk, you can get depth. You know, I mean, it doesn't have to be just a surface reading. Here, you definitely have to get into some kind of a, whether it's a boat, a kayak, something.
But they could launch from Boathouse Beach,
Right,
right, so they could
right.
hit, like, they
Yeah.
could launch from there
Yeah.
and go to the White Brook
Yeah,
Channel.
'cause they're almost right across from each other.
Right.
This is where the boathouse is, and depending upon maybe something like right in the middle here. So you launch from the boathouse, go up to approximately the middle, and then continue on over here, and you should be able to get those readings pretty fast.
So that's 3 that we talked about. Is 3 sufficient? Does anyone want more?
I probably want one in between where the two, White Brook and Broad Brook, the embayments come in, and, you know, the deep section at the boardwalk, so like partway down
In the orange?
in the middle of the main stem, in the green, sort of, yeah,
Right here?
right, maybe right off the point.
So
There's the bulge to the left that was probably like, yep, and then there's a point right there, just to the north of there.
So up here in this area?
Yeah.
What I'm
Just
starting to
offshore
think about
there.
is reproducibility of these
Yeah,
locations.
that's why you go off the point, in between the 2 points.
Can we GPS them in some way?
We certainly can. I mean, you know, usually, unless you have a $3,000 GPS, it's usually within 20, 30 feet. Sometimes a little bit better. If you're willing to sit there, the longer you sit there, the more accurate your GPS is going to be for you. So, but certainly, there's no problem with taking coordinates, and then within 20 feet or so, you'll go back to that same spot.
You can always pick landmarks too. Like
Yeah.
big tree overhanging, I think, off that point.
Yep.
Stand right under the tree.
Well, there
Until
are.
it falls in the water.
Well, that's actually
I
there.
would pick that.
There are actually, in this area, there are some trees that literally
Nice
do
overhanging.
overhang, which is actually part of the habitat evaluation is it's a great perch for birds. And they literally do sit on that perch. And I've been lucky enough to paddle by and literally get the dropping on my shoulder. And they were so kind to me, so yeah.
That's good luck.
Good luck.
Yes, that's the way I took it. I said thank you, I
So
appreciate that.
Remind me, we're testing the day of the application?
No, 7 days.
7 days
Yeah.
before,
prior.
and then when do we test again? What's the follow-up window? 7 days after?
I would
Once you,
say,
once you apply, it's too late. You know, what are you gonna do?
well,
But isn't that
you
what we
would-
wanna know?
You would then have that to gauge for, potentially for future
Yeah.
applications based on weather and temperature and,
It can be a success management way
Yeah.
to measure it too.
So what we would, let's, if we could, not make it 7 days, but no more than 7 days. So whether or not it's 3 days, 4 days, as long as that data can get to the commission. And
well, I just wouldn't want it to get to the commission, 24 hours before they want to go
Right,
out there and
right.
not be able to look at it.
right, no, I
you
understand
know,
that. So
No more than
within,
7, no less than 48,
sure.
is that, or
It's-
72?
And day of, will they apply?
And then post, I suggestion it might be 2 weeks.
So it's 3 sets of readings.
Mm-hmm.
3?
Well, we said
What's that? Before?
before, day of, and post.
Oh, you actually do want day of?
I don't know, do we want day of?
It's I mean, you can ask for that, but
Before
that's,
or after?
I don't think I've ever seen anybody have a DO meter as they're applying,
Yeah, I don't think it's
Well, what is-
necessary for.
What does the
Wild
before really
stuff.
get you though?
Gives you the baseline.
Yeah.
But if it's up to 7 days before,
Yeah, it's no longer the baseline.
that's not really reflective of,
Well,
could potentially not be reflective of conditions the day of treatment, depending on,
again, historically, looking at a lot of different bodies of water, the DO 7 days later should not be radically different unless, you're talking about, a very small body of water that gets hit by the sun all day long. But for something like the size of this pond, 7 days later, I mean, again, that's why if the closer we get to the actual date, the better off the commission will be, as long as it's not, again, we're
Unless
not gonna
we
be
can't look
calling
at
you the night before and say, hey, here's the numbers, what do you say? So, but 7 days
things.
shouldn't change the dissolved oxygen readings all that much.
alright.
Okay.
So just to go over everything in the project that we just discussed, one of the ecological restoration limited project requirements is the sequencing of your project. So if you could just briefly describe from A to Z, what everything is gonna be happening.
Okay, I may, because it's off the top of my head, I may miss something, but basically, we've already established, where the vegetation is most prevalent. We have a little legend here, and we broke it down to 4 different areas. We know from this map here, approximately where the actual species are located. So we know that we want to hit the areas with the Eurasian milfoil, every place that we possibly can. This area down in here, because of the low depth of water, we're probably not going to be able to treat this area in here. The areas that are most likely, again, almost, I'm not going to guarantee anything, but certainly most likely are the areas by the boardwalk, by the boathouse beach where the boat ramp is now. This cove here is very heavily infested with not only the milfoil, but it's just covered in algae and macrophytes. So certain areas we know more than others. Others will be determined in the field. And again, the commission can be informed when we'll be going out there and actually taking a look. We're gonna come up with the applicator or at least their company, and we'll say, this area makes sense, this area makes sense, let's leave this area alone. So that will be a call in the field probably towards the end of June or so. They'll then come back no more than 7 days before the application, take a dissolved auction reading, submit it to the commission for their approval. If the commission deems that the readings are sufficient, they'll give their okay. They'll then come out and do the actual application based upon what was priorly approved. No more than 15 acres of the pond at one time.
How long does it take? Is this like an afternoon or
Oh
2
no,
days?
they're fast. I mean, they're out there in their boat. They're zipping along. Yeah, I mean, this is their. If you or me were doing it, you know, but this is what they do. So you know, and the company has a long history, and they're just. Some companies I trust more than others. The people that I've spoken to have been exceptionally helpful. Because in some cases you have to depend upon your company to be honest with you, and of course they're in the business. This is what they want to do, and as mentioned, if there was a way around this, if we could control the watershed better, if there was other ways that we could address the macrophyte and algae situation, I would certainly go with those methods rather than this. But for Nashawanic Pond, given its condition, given its watershed size, given where it's located, on and on, this method just is the next logical step in keeping the pond a healthy, viable body of water. So they'll come out, they'll do their thing, signs will be posted, we'll try to get
I was
some.
just gonna say the signs, notice and sign should be a week before.
Well, the sign, well, again, from the standpoint of the educational component to the community, you know, we can, that can go out, you know, whenever. That can go weeks ahead of time. Just that this is, you know, what's going on, because once we go out with the company and say these are the areas they're treating, they're not going to come out tomorrow and do the actual treatment. Again, they're going to have to do the dissolved oxygen readings. They're going to have to, you know, come back. They're going to have to schedule it in. They have other jobs, you know. So giving people a heads up ahead of time certainly is not a bad thing. Signs posted around the pond for those people who don't get the media sources, whether it's the Facebook page of the Nashawanic Pond, whether it's the Gazette, whether it's word of mouth. Signs will be posted. The application will happen. 2 weeks later, they'll come back, do dissolved oxygen readings, because by then, this is a very fast-acting herbicide and algicides. One of the things about systemic is that you'll have to have weeks before you see anything, and because it literally has to make its way through the vegetation, the cells of the vegetation. And what happens with systemic sometimes, if you put a high application rate in and you kill the first part of the plant, then the rest of the herbicide can't make its way into the rest of the plant. So you're actually defeating the purpose. You following me there? Mm-hmm. So, but what we will see is within days, the vegetation should be dying back. So we should see, you know, a very fast acting herbicides. 2 weeks later, it's still going to be being disposed of. I say disposed of, but it's actually, you know, you're talking about the decay process, the bacteria doing its magic, which will again be reported back to the commission.
By you?
Whether it's through the company, whether, I mean, I'm not sure how much I'm going to be retained throughout the process here. This is what I've agreed to do to this point, and I'd be more than happy to continue on with this project. But somebody will, whether it's the company, whether it's somebody from the city, but somebody will certainly get to you. And then we wait and we see how fast it comes, because again, it will come back, how fast it comes back, whether or not we want to treat again that same year, hopefully not, you know, we'll see. But again, it's been such a fast start. We're still in March and we're getting pretty good clumps of algae already on the pond, which ordinarily the ice is just melting. So we may find that this is a very abnormal year, and we may not be able to tell a lot going forward, how it's going to react in future generation, the future years, because ordinarily we don't really see this coming in till, you know, a couple months from now. It's starting to. It's got a big head start this year.
So two things. One, you know, for the sake of covering contingencies, assuming money was no object,
Which it isn't.
and yet, so what would be the maximum number of applications per year if funding were not an issue?
I can't imagine doing more than 2.
Okay, because I don't want, I would like to be specific
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
you know, it's not just gonna be dose after dose after
Yeah.
dose in the event that some mysterious pool of money becomes available.
Yeah, it doesn't, to me, even, again, with that unlimited source, from an environmental perspective, it doesn't make sense to
That's
do more
what
than
I'm
2.
concerned
Yeah.
with. And then the other has to do with, the comment about emergent vegetation and the habitat protection zones, and that would be, I would want to include, a provision that there be some, contingency plan in the event that there is an accidental destruction of, native emergent vegetation and or, vegetation in the habitat protection zone, that there be some sort of restoration considerations, because that's counter to the effort.
The emergent vegetation is, for the most part, I believe what they're referring to is like the arrowhead and the bulrushes and so on. So those are a little easier to reproduce. They're rooted, you can come out and reproduce them. If for some reason something happens in that habitat protection zone, these are not rooted macrophytes or algae, so you would push a little bit over. I'm not sure what you would want us to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I just would not want to see, you know, if there were some catastrophic failure of, you know, the tank of
Yeah.
of chemicals, that, you know, there not be an area that's completely destroyed. And you know, I'm not sure whose responsibility that is. If that is the applicator, if that's their responsibility to provide that.
Well, from this, I mean, this is what pops into my head is if we say we get 100 square foot area of death, you could relocate some of the.
You could selectively transit that.
Right.
If
I
a
mean,
black hole.
God forbid, I hope it doesn't
Areas of
happen.
dead or stressed vegetation are not good things.
But literally, because there's still going to be so much in other places, it wouldn't be hard to physically cover that area with vegetation,
Just
the
give it
rooted
its sort.
vegetation. You know, because there's not a lot of it, we really couldn't transplant. They would have to go out and purchase it and reproduce it that way.
Changing topics slightly, is there a way we can put in the order of conditions procedures for changing the herbicides if we
I was
decide-
gonna say any change in proposed chemicals has to come before the commission.
Yeah, that should be in the notice, but if it's not, certainly
I
it
may
should
even
be.
reiterate,
Yeah.
only because
Yep.
the two don't often
Yep.
or always go together.
Yeah, every year, I mean, whether it's me or somebody else, if this is done in 2017, you're gonna see somebody coming before you again. Whether it's actually through this hearing or whether it's through some other means of communication, but under no conditions should somebody be going out there and applying without first getting approval from the commission.
There will be a pre-application notification requirement that's linked to the DO readings, as well as post-application or annual monitoring and reporting requirements.
Are you talking about informal approval or are you talking about a notice of intent?
It depends.
Yeah.
It wouldn't, I would say it wouldn't have to be a notice of intent, it could be an amended order at the most,
If the change in herbicides was,
depending on.
yeah.
you know, if you're gonna go from this to the systemic,
Mm-hmm.
then, you know, it's not what, okay, granted, there isn't a huge outpouring of public interest in the meeting tonight, but the whole point is, and I'm not at all trying to imply that this is what anyone would be doing, but in general, is to avoid the bait and switch,
Mm-hmm.
so.
And then what about ongoing conditions for maintenance?
So it gets a little tricky. We can issue up to a 5-year order of conditions. I mean, the maintenance is annual applications or applications as necessary. We could do with, you know, it's within the commission, if there's a request, it's within the commission's discretion to extend an order for multiple periods of up to 3 years each.
Because I think
But the burden's then on whoever's responsible for the
Right.
project to make that request within the
Right.
regulatory time.
And I think you'll probably see something like that for the maintenance order conditions for the basins. That was, the order I believe was written in 2011. And there's not a pool of money all of a sudden coming in our way, so probably you will be seeing somebody, you know, saying, can we have an extension on those?
Those are probably good till 2018 with the Permit Extension Acts,
Yeah, with the extension.
so. They just extended everything twice by 2 years. Okay, so I know I've asked for Gary to provide a few things. I certainly need time to write this. I would like to have, could I get those things before the next meeting?
Sure.
Okay, so
Continue.
would anyone care to make a motion to continue to April 11th at 6 p.m.?
I would like to make a motion to continue this hearing to the April 11th meeting at 6 p.m.
I'll second the motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
So moved.
So what I probably will do, Melissa, is write up everything that, in my memory, that you asked for.
I can always
12 pages of
refresh your
minutes right
memory.
here.
Well, that's what I was gonna say.
Once I go
I'll
through all
make
my
a-
check boxes.
I'll make a little bulleted list of, I think you want this, 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 and this. Did I miss anything? And you can fill in the
Looks like you need
blanks.
more ashes
That's
over
even
mine.
better, because that'll prompt me to do it.
Okay.
She's got one big paragraph.
So that's the, it's 6 o'clock again?
6 o'clock is the standard.
Standard time.
Yep.
Okay.
There will be other stuff. We'll have a, well, we could always, we've received a couple other requests, but, we'll see where this goes. I'll make sure you know when the agendas get posted, but we can always confirm the agenda order.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, appreciate both of you coming in, your time.
We expected to be out the door here with concerned citizens.
I have to leave here in a moment.
Okay, so what do we need you for?
Anything?
What do we need?
My backpack is what we need.
Yes, it's right over there.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay,
And thank you for all your help in getting this to where it is now.
Not much of anything.
Am I gonna see you tomorrow night at the?
I have another, I have to be in Amherst for another meeting.
Oh.
so.
Pleasant Street Mills and their ramp, to the, not Pleasant Street Mills, the other one, Cottage Street. Cottage Street. Yeah, so it looked like, that was kind of on hold, and looked like they were trying to get access to the city's right of way to put in their rampy thingy thing. And the last meeting, we talked about how it looked like they started, so I guess we're assuming that that's all squared away.
I have no idea.
It looks
Okay.
pretty done.
It's not a city,
I was done now.
it's not a city
Goodbye.
project, so I
Gotcha.
can't tell you what their status is, it's a private project, so.
Right, but I thought it was a city easement thing that they were.
They got an
following with.
easement, but that's all they need from the
Okay.
city,
Look,
was
it looks
easement
complete
for
to me.
access,
so
so.
we're up to date on SWIP, weekly SWIP reports.
There's no other updates right now.
No other updates right now, all right.
So do you need me for anything else?
No.
I have this that I think it's pointless to sign off.
Laughing at me, I don't know.
Any updates on Pleasant Street Mills?
You can, there's nothing, no, there's nothing to report. I mean, it's on track, so.
You're digging.
The second contractor will, be starting probably after April 1st, and they'll be in there putting in curbing, paving, landscaping. Yes, and that'll happen during the month of April. And then they'll be out of there, and then the rest of the project will be completed in the final paving.
Does that mean the bike path will be open for the most part?
If you saw my post on Facebook, so the bike path is closed. It's officially closed, and nobody should be going out there. There's still work that needs to be done in that area. When they're putting in the granite curbing, there's probably bucket trucks that are gonna be, you know, swinging their arms, and so until we feel it's safe for pedestrians to be back there, it's shut down. Thank you for your continued patience on this.
Thank you for your update.
Okay, all right.
Oh, night.
Good night.
Good night.
Wait, Gary, can I grab you for 1 second? It's not this related.
Okay, so anything else?
Jessica.
Okay,
No, run,
good night.
run
All right.
away.
We had another question, but I forget what it was. Totally forget what it was.
That walkway is different than the plan. It's not significantly different, but
There's no stairs, it's just
yeah.
like, yeah.
It's all ramp now, I
Two.
believe.
Yeah.
So it's all handicap accessible. I assume it's the correct angles to make it correct. Looks a little steep.
Do we care if it's not?
Well,
I mean,
No.
that's not our that's not
not
our
our problem, but-
purview.
of course we can.
Well, of course we care. It's not our jurisdiction.
That's true.
We have to pretend not to care for the purposes of being recorded
Oh yeah.
and putting it in the minutes.
You're saving up, right?
Oh no.
Oh, no.
Did you retitle them?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. It's called 32816. What do you think?
I like it.
I have a lot of information there.
Yeah.
Talking
See?
about a lot of the same things. More than once, maybe.
Yeah. So
I
that's,
wrote it down.
that's when you go back and you're like, oh yeah, we talked about that. Oh yeah, we talked about that.
Possibly true. I learned a bit though, that was interesting.
Yeah.
And we never just, we'll come back to discuss like frequency of testing, or we
Yeah,
never
she's
got to
got a
that.
list of
Okay.
things that she's gonna compile.
So I recommend that you review them sooner rather than later because you'll forget, and then it gives Melissa ample time to fix them.
Mom will take care of it.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Okay,
Moving right along.
Okay.
I'll have that McLovin now.
seriously, I'm starving. So, any word from Bernie?
Have not heard anything back.
When was the last time you reached out to Mr. Caldwell?
Wednesday.
Okay. Try again this Wednesday.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Updates, Mount Tom Estates. Oh, open space updates. Any? I'm sorry, you have your own line. We have an open space line.
I know, it's so exciting.
And there are no updates, right?
Do you want me to
Okay,
take?
that's okay.
Want me to take minutes?
I have an open space update.
Oh,
Kind of an open space update, but presented from the CPA was a preliminary request for funding for the bridge that goes between Southampton and East Hampton. And it's very preliminary because they don't have the numbers down yet, but that's where it would be location-wise. So half would be paid by Southampton, half would be paid by East Hampton. And it would connect the new trail that connects up to the Paul Street area off Ranch Avenue.
Neat.
So
Excellent.
we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Probably in the fall we'll get an official something.
But however much money they have in there, it's not enough.
Well,
I'll
probably,
tell you that right
yeah, they
now.
probably don't have enough. But it has to go in front of us, it has to go in front of Southampton, and there's also natural heritage.
How wide is the river there?
Thousands of feet. It's
The
miles.
river is not thousands of feet
Miles.
Isn't
wide.
there a lot of
Floodplain
wetlands
is,
there? Wasn't it a super long bridge?
Well, there are wetlands, there are floodplain, there's floodplain.
They have to figure out how high the bridge has to be above the
Above
water
the
because it's
100-year
navigable
flood.
water. It's because,
It's chapter 91.
something like that, yes.
You should show them the little post and decky thingamabob that you drive your Bobcat on at your
That'll
house.
scare people.
That thing still scares me to this day, and I haven't even.
Why?
I don't know.
Hasn't moved a quarter of an inch. Pilot drove those things 12 feet in the ground.
Oh, that is that deep?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that makes me feel a little better.
You should have seen the trestle.
So,
I did
yeah,
see
there's some issue with navigable water issues, so maybe you're right with
Oh,
that.
yes.
Yeah, just take that number and quintuple it, and then add 6 and double that, and then you get to about the right place.
But
And
they're
then
gonna do an
add 5
engineering
years
study.
for the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're gonna do an engineering study to figure it out, so.
Wait, what water body is this?
The Manhan,
Crosses the Manhattan
Down,
between Southampton and East Hampton.
The Pomeroy Meadow Conservation Area,
Yeah.
where they have that, near where the overlook is, in that general, have you walked in there?
I don't think so.
It's neat,
I'll check it out.
it's not very rigorous.
Very nice.
Conservation area?
Yeah, you park at the end of Ranch Ave,
Okay.
and the trailhead is there.
And then you can go into Southampton and park at the end of Meadowbrook? No.
I live off Meadow.
Yeah. What's the one in Southampton that it's off of?
Let's see.
And then you can go in and so you can see.
That
like,
could
you
be
can-
Meadow Street, is it possible?
No.
This
There's
little,
a meadow.
could be Meadow right here, this could be Meadow.
Meadowlark. It's Meadow something.
Yeah, if you say so.
What's the Southampton Trail System called? Do we have?
Can't remember.
Whitmore Conservation Area,
Is that ITTE or HIT?
W with 2 T's.
It's kind of like a stick figure person without any
Whittemore?
legs.
We have a friend who lives in Westwood. Oh, it is Whittemore.
Whitmore.
Sorry. ITTE, Whittemore. But, Whittemore.
Great.
So,
Okay.
It'd be nice.
That's good, that's moving forward. And we heard of that at another new open space updates.
Yes.
Okay, Mount Thomas Estates.
Oh, just about the other status update for
sorry.
the enforcement order, the letter.
I will-
Pending,
I
Jay
will-
talking
I
to
will take another shot at it.
Bernie so that we can get back out there.
And so you're asking him about his piles and about a site visit?
Yes, both.
Oh, okay.
Both site visit for Groveland Street and what the status of the piles, they're still there. From what I can see from South Street.
Okay.
He's trolling us at this point.
Yeah.
It's just all a game.
I don't think so. It doesn't read, yeah. Anyway, okay, compliance updates? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, Mount Thomas Estates, DEP file number 151248. The gentleman who was here at the beginning of the meeting, the new condo association board wants to understand, or has taken steps to understand their responsibilities under for stormwater management, O&M. And they have requested that the commission come to the site for a visit meeting,
The 9th?
except they can't do weekends. So
Oh,
they've requested a weeknight, which I said was a limiting factor. That said, the week prior to that's not a calendar, that's a clock. I always do that. Everybody. So, the week prior to our April 11th meeting, so between April 4th and April 11th, who has availability on an evening or evenings, and who would like to be there and chime in on
I
X,
should
Y, and Z?
probably try to go if I can.
Mhm.
What-
Especially since you were were you part of the permitting?
Barely.
Barely,
No,
yeah, we were all barely,
Yeah,
and by we all, I mean you and I.
Is it possible to do that Monday the 4th?
Monday the 4th?
We can offer Monday the 4th, does that work?
Oh,
Huh?
that's for me.
It works for me.
my
It's
phone
the
is.
4th.
No,
Let me
it's not
more-
that, no,
Did
that's
my
a,
phone go in here again?
Reboot is home.
Well, it was all throughout the meeting, so I shut it off.
there's no more March.
Yeah.
March is pretty much over.
Oh, that's next Monday?
The 4th is, that exactly.
It's April, it's totally, April never comes.
It's weeks from now.
I could do that on Monday.
Okay, so I will,
Monday?
I'd rather not.
You wanna
That's
pick it?
fine,
You
yeah,
wanna
we
pick
don't
it?
Is that
Yeah.
okay? I feel like
Yeah,
it would
no,
be
no, no,
educational,
no.
but I regret I
no,
would not be there.
it will be a
I
blitz.
went to inform you that I do not care about this and will not be there.
So I'm gonna ask for 5:15,
Okay.
Sure.
is that,
Do wanna pick a second night just in case they come back and say no? while we're all
Sure.
sitting there?
Any night but that, and the weekends, and
Ugh.
April.
April.
I could Tuesday, Wednesday.
Tuesday, Wednesday, either of those, fine, just,
Oh, I could do Tuesday.
I can do Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday or Thursday.
So
Monday,
4-4,
Tuesday,
4-5,
Thursday.
or 4-7,
sounds good.
all at 5:15.
Yep.
So you're
Okay.
offering all of these.
I will. That way there's no more back and forth. If they can't, and they seem, they want to have this
Yeah, I
meeting.
think they wanna do this.
So it's just that weekends, were not suitable. That poster's kind of freaking me out.
What?
The light on the water, it kind of glows.
I'm not sure where that goes in the minute.
It does not.
Put that under general business.
Yeah. I'm fatigued. Okay, Paul Street Extension, there are two, reports, one dated March 18th and one dated March 25th. So we've received weekly reports, now that work is commenced on lot number 123 Paul Street. Backfilled house foundation, graded site and started framing new house, fiber log barrier and silt fence are working, no signs of any erosion. Silt sacks are in catch basins and roadway is clean. Was that also your?
Yep.
What's the address for the work?
23.
Number 23, or yeah, 20.
And it's NOI site plan lot number 1. But it does appear to be,
It's the first lot on the other side of the road from you.
First lot in the right, as you go down.
right. Oh, and there's a fence in back there.
There's a what?
Chain link fence,
Where?
Oh, down
25
here.
Paul Street.
Oh,
Okay, so we will
at
file.
the top of the slope.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Great.
We got our Pleasant Street Mills update. We talked about 15 Cottage Street. There are no updates about the Oxbow. No updates about Town Beach.
Nothing happening.
Also known as
There's just some areas that you need to fill in,
Boathouse.
erosion that would need to be just tuned up.
Okay, so and that's Park and Rec.
I don't think they could do it.
Lathrop has submitted a request for amended order of conditions to do additional treatment within the area that they previously permitted.
Okay.
Did I forward that?
I didn't see it.
it
Okay.
sounds familiar.
It does. Did we?
It does, okay.
Did you mention it last week?
I mentioned it
You
and it was
mentioned it too.
pending and it
Yeah.
actually came in, so,
I don't think I saw it. but
it has, there's been, they submitted a letter to the commission via email saying that this is what they wanted to do. I replied saying, here's DEP's policy on amending orders, you need to notify abutters and advertise in the paper. If they can be on the April 11th agenda, they'll be on the April 11th agenda. But they have to have the ad published in the Gazette on Monday, the latest, the 4th of April.
Which is next Monday.
Which is next Monday.
Check.
Okay.
Can we go back for 1 second?
Was
What
that-
should I put next to Nashawanic Mills? It had said that
Walkway appears to
Commissioner
be finished.
Buttrick was going to, yes.
It looks like the walkway is finished, but there's nothing happening behind it as far as rain gardens and
Here.
things like that. So I say no activity.
Wish it was your candy stash.
It's okay, thank you.
And help.
Should I put what you were saying about the boat access? There's areas that need to be filled in.
There was a little erosion in the fall, so there's just some areas that need to get tuned up and reseeded, that's all.
Yeah, we had a
Is somebody
pretty
gonna
good
request
rain
that?
before.
Yeah, just in the growing season when it's done.
So,
Who's gonna do
okay,
that?
so I'll email.
Jay is. Nothing.
I'll email
He
Jess
got rid of
Allen.
the concrete. Oh, this
Receiving raking of eroded, that's not a word, areas. The way I wrote it, it wasn't a word.
Which one?
Of. The pen just. Okay, we just went over Lathrop, PCT Mutterfield.
They got machines back there. I haven't seen
Okay.
too much activity, but it looks like they're getting ready to go.
Okay, so we should be
The tree
seeing.
fell on the trail and broke it in one area.
Oh, no.
It's repairable. It's repairable.
Williston, no updates. General business, draft wetlands protection ordinance. We did not get an answer from Jess about Google
Oh yeah,
Docs.
so yeah, I emailed her.
Oh, okay.
And she said that it would definitely not be a good thing.
Okay, so
we
we
did
won't
it
do
on
it that
Google
way.
Docs, but I did send it like 15 minutes before this meeting to everyone. So yeah, you'll have to like look at it and
Talk about it at the next meeting.
Yeah.
I don't think the next meeting would be a good meeting to
It's
discuss.
gonna be a long
Yeah.
It's gonna be so maybe I'm gonna move that one to,
April
28th?
no, because this
No,
is the 28th.
25th. 11 plus
So-
14 is 25.
Yeah.
there are portions of it that I highlighted. Like I didn't really know what severability was and if we really needed that.
Can you cut it right
I know, but like I don't know if I've ever seen that in other bylaws.
Severable,
So.
It
not
must.
severable, or severable.
So just look at that and see what you think.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Meeting minutes approval, March 14th, 2016. Somewhere here, our meeting minutes. Can I have that form?
I'm not sure how I feel about the underlined bullets.
I
I
don't.
didn't
I
review
didn't
them, I just
underline
wrote them.
anything.
Whoa, how did you do that?
I don't know, but they didn't all get underlined.
That's
Seems
amazing.
unfair.
Can I reverse
Not
for
even
a
bad.
second?
Yes, sure.
The old camper trailer, are we following up on that at all? And that was it, thank you.
I was just kidding, actually.
Oh,
Maybe it's a big
we
one.
are supposed to write a letter to the person who appears to be the property owner based on the site plan provided by PC2. Okay.
I move that we approve the minutes from March 14th.
I'll second the motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Okay. So we have received an RDA, from Pan Am to verify sensitive areas, in support of their herbicide application. They're only required to have sensitive areas verified. We did this a few years back.
Yes, we did.
So we're doing it again. I'll put this on the agenda and I will contact Mr. Morris regarding a site visit.
Is there just a short portion of the railroad that's
Very
in
short.
East Hampton?
Yes,
So it's a
yeah.
It's basically
pretty
down by
limited
the
scope.
Connecticut River /
That's
Oxbow.
what I thought based on the maps.
Yeah.
Great.
So there's that, there's this, WPC, there's a special permit decision about Hampton Care Facility. There's an email from,
Ooh, dispensary.
Oh yeah.
that's Jake's.
No comments.
Jake, you're blushing.
No comments, no comments.
Is this you?
No, not opening a dispensary.
It's in your building.
It's
It
just
is
in the building.
It just happened to be in the building, that's all.
It doesn't.
Alright.
This is pretty. Wait, where is this?
Between Eastworks and Pinole 180.
It's gonna be at Jay's house.
It's like
Right
the
on
one
Main Street
that's
there, the
really
one
close
that-
to Pleasant Street.
It's
Where they just
211.
put in like a new doorway and there's like a new
It's
concrete.
122.
Oh wow.
Driving.
I got that there. It's near Eastworks though, so.
It's between Eastworks and
Okay,
What's the
here's,
211 Pleasant Street? Was that just a typo?
okay, Argo Tech, Yankee Hill Machine, we're getting Yankee Hill Machine.
Goody, we get a gun manufacturing
Oh,
facility
yes.
in East Hampton too.
Well,
That's
they've
not by
been
Big
here,
Y.
they've been here, right?
No, they've been.
No.
Oh, they're in
They've
Florence,
been
this
in-
is Florence
they were in
people, okay.
Bay State Village.
Yes, I forgot about that. Just, I knew they'd been around for a long time.
Do they actually
That's like
make
down by
guns
that
or
old
do
BJ
they just
building, right?
make
That's
They
parts
have a
and-
firing range, or they will.
Here.
It's not public.
I know, but my dog freaks out anytime she hears shots.
It's in,
Probably
Inside.
She can hear.
where do you
Yeah,
live?
what do you
Nowhere
do?
near there, near Butterfield.
Okay.
Did you see the tree?
No, I'm going to go check it out.
Picture on
Is it a big tree?
It's all, they cut it up, somebody, yeah, it was like 18-inch diameter, rotten thing.
Is it a pine?
I feel like you didn't talk about the shooting range. in the paper.
Evidently it does not like the proposed project.
It's not in here either.
It wasn't.
That's just the decision. And this
So
is just a copy of the,
These were approved. Is
agreement
that
with
this decision?
DSET. for the peer review. So we should be seeing by
This is just-
April
we're
4th
not doing anything
revised
with this stuff.
stormwater plans and docs. And that is what DSET will be reviewing as opposed to the originals. So,
It's
So
the tree.
how does it work?
That's where it kinda crunched it,
Emily
but someone
Stockman
cleaned it
used
up
to
and
be
cut
the
it.
peer review.
But it's all
she's
okay.
doing the wetlands
Repair.
related
I haven't
portion.
worked
Tree
with her
and-
before, so what does
Yeah.
that mean?
Nothing, that
Okay.
means
Go
nothing.
look, go look
Unless she's
really
your
well,
boss
you'll
right
see it
now.
Kinda crunched the tree.
Nothing.
Then nothing.
Mm,
Okay.
Not too bad.
What about Doucette?
that tree just was not too happy about this
You don't
project.
work for them.
Okay. Who would work with them?
Doesn't matter. You're not working with them right now. And you have no say in that. You have
Or
no,
do you?
not yet.
Project management? Sometimes. But not this one.
No.
So that's fine.
So, no, I don't think you have any conflicts of interest. All right, anything else?
Motion to adjourn?
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes, I think there's several.
Would anyone care to
I
second,
think
third,
we need
fourth,
to
and fifth?
discuss these. There's a motion on the table, let's have a debate.
All those in favor?
Aye.
So moved.
8 o'clock.
What do we do with these, things, just throw them out?